Today we're going to talk about parenting. You know, a lot of us have read a lot of parenting books, gone to parenting classes, and one thing that people still walk away with reporting, and that is that it seems great and simple when it comes in the class, but when it comes practically down to it, things just don't work out as smoothly. And you know what? Today we're going to talk about why that might be happening. One of the most important pieces of parenting is this magic word that's probably the most difficult for us to keep up with, and that's consistency. Consistency is the key, yet also the challenge. That's what we're going to talk about on today's podcast. My name is Daniel Ifra, LCSW. Here we are together on the SaneStorming Show, where we SaneStorm together ways, not brainstorm, but SaneStorm together ways to keep each other sane in a complex world. So we're talking about consistency, and that's a word that I think scares a lot of us simply because it may not be our natural strength. Now, we all know some people have an easier time being consistent. Sometimes people are too consistent, and when they're too consistent, that can get in the way as well. So let me break down why consistency, what the value of consistency is, why it is so integral in parenting, and I'm going to break it down into three different categories of development. We're going to talk about consistency on a behavioral level. We're going to talk about consistency on an emotional level. And we're also going to talk about consistency on an authoritative level. So let's start with the behavioral. We all know that as humans, we are behaviorally driven. Our behaviors are pretty much set into patterns based on the responses that we got to our behaviors in the past, which causes us to either repeat or not to repeat the behavior. Once it's repeated X amount of times, it becomes behavioral, becomes a pattern, and then we kind of get stuck to that behavior. So for this one, it's pretty actually self-explanatory why consistency is so integral to behavioral, because that exactly is how behavioral behaviors are formed, through consistent, repetitive actions and behaviors. So consistency is basically a no-brainer there. If you take out the consistency, it is going to be super hard to break any old patterns and to create a new behavioral pattern. So, and with parenting, behavioral is, I would say, a solid third, if not more, of the job. So behavioral, we got to be very, very considerate about the behavioral stuff. Number two is the emotional piece. Emotional wise, I mean, every child and every adult for that matter needs to feel a certain sense of security. Security is key. We all, and especially in the earlier years when a child is developing, security cannot be overstated. So what happens is when kids feel secure, then their behaviors become more grounded, their emotions become more grounded, and they're just more settled overall. And then you get behaviors and development which is closer into normal range when you have a strong sense of security. Part of security is predictability. Predictability is a major piece of what gives us security, right? If I, let's say, sleep in my bed tonight, and tomorrow night I sleep at my friend's house, and in 2 nights I sleep at an uncle's house, you don't have the security that my bed gives me. Of course, security is not based on 100% routine. That's not what I'm saying. But a certain sense of predictability is a large part what creates security. Now, predictability means that I know when X happens, Y is going to happen. Where I can predict what my day is going to be like. I could predict that my day is going to be an average day. I can predict today's going to be a really exciting day. I could predict today's an uncertain day. There's a certain amount of security in being able to have a sense of where my day is going to go. But if every day, unfortunately, you have people that are in chaotic situations or kids that are growing up in chaotic families, and every day is another soap opera, another wrench in their life. That's another place where the security goes way down. So security is crucial. A big part of security is predictability. When we talk about predictability, we're going to be talking about consistency. Consistency does not necessarily have to be that I have a consequence every day. That's not what consistency necessarily means. Consistency means when I don't do whatever that gives me a natural if I don't put I'm using this as an example and I'm not suggesting it at this point. If I don't put my socks in the hamper, they're not going to get washed. That, as a consistent response, is what I mean by consistency. So in all parenting, you have the behavioral aspect. We just discussed the emotional aspect. And we're going to talk about the authoritative aspect. And that is that when kids get into a groove of needing to do certain things, despite their sense of, well, I don't feel like it today, or sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't, that it turns into, or can potentially turn into, a breakdown within their sense of authority. I'm not saying not to be flexible. I'm talking here as on a general sense from, again, childhood development. In order to have a certain sense of authority, there has to be a concept that, regardless, even if the feelings, or even if the circumstances will push me otherwise, but I know the buck stops here. And that's what authority means. That's what authority essentially is. So if there's no consistency, you're going to have a breakdown in that authoritative piece. So these are three very crucial pieces that are necessary for any kind of parenting, no matter what. You can plug it into whether you're talking about a behavioral plan, whether you're talking about consistency in a certain sense of security, bedtime, whatever you're talking about. Consistency is really, really important. The challenge becomes, for most of us, first of all, is that some people have a lot going on in their life, right? Talk about multiple children in your family. That is going to be even harder to keep up the consistency. And then you have, even amongst individuals, you have people that are have an easier time keeping consistency, like we said earlier, and some people that have a harder time. So the consistency piece a lot of times has to do with us before we get into it with our kids. I will never create with parents a behavioral plan if I myself am skeptical about their ability to be consistent about that plan, because it's more than worthless. It's actually counterproductive. Kids get the sense that things don't need to be consistent. And then there's the fallout with the whole sense of behavioral and emotional and the authority. And so we want to stay away from that. So if you're going to do something on a parenting level, it's got to be with a certain element of consistency. The problem that we have is consistency is so challenging for so many of us. So how do we tackle this? How do we make some parenting work with consistency, even when we ourselves are not so consistent, let alone being able to give over that consistency to our children? And I'm not going to tell you, I don't want to minimize this challenge, the challenge of needing to be consistent, but we have to figure out a way that it's incorporated in our parenting. So like I said earlier, the key here is not necessarily the consistency in the sense of how often it is, but rather The message is consistent. When that message happens, you got to be consistent about this. So I say that a really, really strategic place to start with all of this is to pick one relatively easy behavior. One relatively easy behavior and something that you know that you can be consistent about, and something that you know you can consistently give it over to your kids. It might be, you might want to start with something as simple as them packing up their own. If you're looking for helping your kids becoming more self-sufficient and you're looking at empowering them to get some things done, have them pack up their briefcases the night before. It can be really something minuscule, but the idea is that it needs to be consistent. Now, the example that I just gave you, like with the briefcases, that would pretty much be on a daily basis during the weekdays on any school night, right? You can have, but that would be something that's more consistent. I do recommend with starting something that has a more of a consistent message. The other thing that you can do is that if, let's say, we're talking about something in terms of a consequence, or something in terms of not a consequence, but a response when a kid has an extreme meltdown, whatever that response is that you work out that's healthy for that child, whether it's some validation together with a behavioral plan to get it to stop, whatever the combination is that you worked out with your therapist, or stay tuned for other episodes on our show, would be ideally is to be consistent, that when you are going to be proactive with that response, make sure that it happens every single time. It may only be the opportunity may only lend itself twice a week, 3 times a week. That's fine, because the message will still be very clear. They'll still be getting that message. So again, when we talk about consistency, we can talk about the positive behaviors, the initiations, getting them to be consistent about any given part of their life, right? And then we can also talk about your responses, whether it's a consequence, whether it's an emotional response, your responses to X, Y, or Z. It needs to be consistent in the sense that every time you have whatever triggers that response, that's the response that they need to get. So that would be another type of consistency. With this plan, what you would do is literally you start with one small thing, and you can keep checking yourself. And if you do that and you got one thing down pat, you can move on to 2. But the biggest mistake that I've seen parents do is that they expect to be consistent about everything, or they'll pick something to be consistent about that's way over their ability. It's just not practical. You got to pick something practical, simple, easy, doable, and stick to it. That is key. And even if that's all you're consistent about, you taught your kids something else, which we did not discuss before. Besides the behavioral aspect is there, and the emotional and the authoritative, you also taught your kid a concept of consistency. You taught your kid a concept of responsibility. You taught your you taught your child the message that repetition, practice makes perfect. That when you do something once and you do it again and you do it again and it works and it succeeds, you keep doing it. You take that to the next level. That's what we're talking about. We have every single parenting message. There's always the message that you're trying to give, the local message. Okay. And we'll get into this in a different day, but there was always that local message that you're giving, but you're also giving a broader message in life in general that you want to convey as well. So that's where we're going here with this consistency. Super, super important. It's got to be your first question you ask yourself whenever you put a plan in place. And if the reason why the plan wasn't effective, or the responses that you created weren't effective, it's either because they weren't consistent, or you got to tweak the actual plan. Either one or both. But that's where it's got to go. Thanks for joining today. And hope to see you again real soon, where we can do some more SaneStorming about some really basic, but yet super important and super integral pieces of just navigating daily life.